This demonstration is all about wedging, the necessary evil to clay making. It's not usually a lot of fun, but it is necessary because it does help get air bubbles out of your clay, and it also gets your clay ready to start working. You may notice, especially the more porcelaneous sorts of clay, that they're very stiff to get started. Once you start beating them around a little bit, they will start to loosen up. So wedging helps you get your clay in order. But the biggest thing is getting those air bubbles out of the clay. So this demonstration is going to talk about the different surfaces you can wedge on, how you should be standing when you're wedging, and the few wedging methods. There's two of them that I'm going to talk about. And also how to prepare your clay when you're done wedging to get it ready for whatever you're going to actually be doing. So let's get started, shall we? As far as the surface that you're going to work on, if you're in a studio situation, then there should be wedging tables there. And a wedging table is going to be made of plaster. This is actually just something that I have in my home studio that I made, and you can see it's relatively thick and it's a big piece of plaster. The beauty of plaster is that it doesn't stick. Your clay is not going to stick to it. And it's also absorbent. So sometimes clay right out of the bag may be a little bit wet. This plaster is going to help pull some of that water out. I've made this plaster in a Rubbermaid tub. You just mix up the plaster and pour it in there. If you know how to work with plaster, that's a great way of just making a really quick wedging table because it pops right out. If you want to do something like that, go ahead and watch the rehydration and dehydration video, and that'll show you kind of a little bit more about how to deal with the wedging table, or how to make a little wedging pad, I guess is what you would call this. But at the studio, you're going to have a table. At home, if you want to make one of these, this is definitely the best bet, but you may not have those options. So a few other things that you may want to consider. Your surface does need to be a non-stick surface. Unfortunately, as you wedge, the surface starts to hold the water, and then your clay starts to stick. Just if you've ever made a pizza crust or a pie crust, you got to put a lot of flour down. It's kind of the same thing. Your clay is going to stick. One thing that you can try that's an easier thing to do is just a piece of canvas. This is not ideal. Your clay will not stick to it until the canvas gets wet. Once the canvas is wet, it will start sticking. But what's not great about a canvas is that as you're wedging, it will start to move around. So it's a little cumbersome to deal with, but in a pinch, a piece of canvas will work just fine. Your other option could be something like a dryware board, which actually is plaster. The funny thing about a piece of drywall is it doesn't have a lot of tensile strength, so that means if I were to bang it on this edge, it would just collapse. It's not good. So if you are using something like this, make sure that whatever's underneath it is very flat and not bumpy, because the pressure of wedging will break the piece of drywall. The other reason this isn't great is because the paper on here will start to tear off. So I would not recommend this, but if you've got a piece of drywall around for whatever reason, this will work for a little while. If you do get paper in your clay, that is okay. It's not going to hurt your clay at all. But once the paper is off the drywall, then you get into the plaster part of the drywall, and you do not want plaster into your clay. So this is not a very good idea, but like I said, if you just need to wedge a little bit, once that paper starts breaking down, you need to stop using that. Another resource that's great is a cement board. I don't have that here, but you can go to Home Depot or Lowe's and actually just get pieces of cement board. That's really great. Now that's going to pull the water out really quickly, so you do have to be careful about that. But none of the cement particles are going to get into your clay, so that will work. And then if you don't have any of those things, you could find a wood surface or something like that. If you are going to do that, you probably will have to move around quite a bit, because again, the second that surface starts to get wet, your clay is going to want to stick to it. So you don't want that. As far as wedging, you are going to need to wedge on a table that is at kind of hip height, maybe a little bit taller. what I like is that when I'm putting my hands down, the table is low enough that I can actually use my body to push down and not my hands to push, because your wrists are gonna wear down real quick and your arms are gonna get really tired if you're kind of at this level trying to wedge like this. It is not easy to do that. So wherever you can kind of push down, that's the height of the table that you're gonna want. If you only have countertops, my suggestion would be to wedge on the floor. It's going to be the same technique I'm going to show you. You'll just be kind of on your knees, wedging on the floor. Sometimes that, if you don't have a lot of upper body strength, that's the best way to do it, because you can really push all of your body into the clay. So, but again, you want to make sure that your table's not up to here, because that will be very hard to wedge. So for me, this is a pretty good situation. You also want a table that's not wobbly. This is not my normal wedging table, and this table wobbles a lot. So I would never want to actually wedge on this table. The table I usually wedge on is a little more secure, so I can kind of get away with it. Okay, so that's your stance, you know what you can wedge on. So let's talk about the clay. When you buy a bagged clay, it's already de-aired. So depending on what you are going to do with it, for instance, if you're going to be making slabs, you may not necessarily have to wedge. The second you work with your clay, though, if you're making coils or you're pinching pots, you're cutting things off of a slab, that is when those little bits of clay have to be wedged up together. If you're using school clay out of a bin, like a studio clay, that has to be wedged. There's a ton of air in that. But what is nice about a new fresh bag is that it is already de-aired, and so you aren't going to have to wedge quite as much or quite as long. I do think it's nice to get into the habit of wedging, whether it's right out of the bag or not, because again, it does prepare your clay to be workable. Okay, like gets all the particles in order and meshes that way. So in order to wedge, you're going to need a wedging table. You're going to need a bag of clay, and you're going to need a cut-off wire. It's important that your clay is not too dry or too wet. Too wet, it's just going to stick all over the place. Too dry, you are probably going to end up throwing it across the room because it's just not going to cooperate. Again, watch the video for rehydration and drying out clay, and I'll talk about both of how to get your clay back if it's dyed, or how to get the water out of it. But we're just going to assume for now that your clay is beautiful, and because it's brand new, right? When you use the wire here, you're going to wrap it around your hands a few times so that it's taut. And then when I go to wedge, even if I only need a little bit of clay, I'm going to go ahead and grab kind of a lot of clay. I would rather wedge once and then have some stuff left over that's already wedged and I can just pull into my bag. I also don't like to take little slivers of clay. So let's say this is all that I actually needed. Well, if I take this sliver of clay, I need to get it into a ball in order to start wedging. And what I don't want to do is start bending it into a ball like this, because I'm putting a lot of air into it. So I like to keep a cube sort of situation. And if I feel like, gosh, I can't wedge all this because I don't know what I'm doing, or I'm just not strong enough, then you can go ahead and break it down into actual cubes, which is what I will do here. For starters, you might want to just start with about a softball or a baseball size. If you have bigger hands, it's not going to help you to have a tiny little piece of clay. It's actually a little bit more difficult to wedge little tiny bits of clay, so just know that. Also, never leave your bag open, because your clay is drying out every second that you're leaving it open. So I just like to give it a little twist, and then I'll kind of put it down, or I'll put it up against something so that the bag does not open. Okay, now I am ready to wedge. I want to go ahead and put this in a ball, and I'm going to show two different types of wedging. One is called the ram's head, and you can see why it's called the ram's head, although I do have to say that I call it the bull's head because I just like that better. Maybe it's all this Texas that's happening, but I do live in Texas, and so we have bulls here. And I also really like to say you take the bull by the horns, and you'll see what I mean here in a minute. And then the other way, which is the bull's head or ram's head, is easy to teach, and it's usually kind of for beginners. It's the best way to go about it. The spiral is how I actually wedge. It's much quicker, it's much more intuitive if you ask me. So I'm going to let you decide what you would like to do, but you can try them both. Okay, so now that I have my ball of clay, which by the way, the last thing you want to do if you have your clay in your hand right now and you're kind of waiting for this to all happen and you're like this, if you got your ball of clay, put it down, wrap it up. Don't keep doing this into your hand. Why? Why shouldn't you do that? Of course it's because you're pulling the water out of the clay, and you don't want to pull the water out of the clay. So once you get your ball, put it down, and then when you're ready to wedge, pick it back up again. Okay, got my ball of clay, and we are going to come down here onto the wedging table, and we're going to get moving here. You are going to be using the tips of your fingers and the heel of your hand. You're kind of wedging between these two parts. What you're going to do to get started is you're going to take the heel of your hand and you're going to kind of, at this diagonal, you're going to be at the top of the clay and you're going to push in a little bit, you're going to push down a little bit, and you're going to push away from you. And then you're going to, with the tips of your finger, pull this all the way up. And then you're going to, again, we're kind of getting a little bit longer here, you're going to push in, down, and away. And then pull it all the way back up. You might have to move your clay around. It's in, down, and away, and you are pulling up toward you. Okay. Now you're starting to see the bull's head start to form. And so now I'm going to start talking in terms of anatomy. So we've got the horns right here, and we have the chin right here. So when I'm actually doing this, I'm going to take the bull by the horns. I'm going to press the horns in. I'm going to press down, and I'm going to push away from me, kind of where the eye sockets would be. And then I'm going to, at the horns, with my fingertips, pull all the way up to the chin of the bull, and then again push in, down, and away. Okay. Now, a few things are going to happen with this. You're going to, if you are pushing too far down, you're going to elongate the clay. When you do that, that is not good, because what you're going to then end up having to do is press and fold these eye sockets back in, and that essentially just put air back into your clay. So you don't want to do that. I'm going maybe halfway, maybe even a little bit less when I'm doing this. So if you are pressing down too hard, then you're going to elongate that. What you want is for your wedged clay to kind of remain in this ball shape. Okay? So we're kind of stuck in this ball shape. The second that it starts to lose that shape, you're doing something wrong. So too much, when you elongate, too much pressure down. The other thing that happens is if you are only on top here and you're doing your thing just from the top, you end up getting horns. The second that this starts to happen, you need to deal with it immediately. These things can actually pull way out if you don't stop. And this is another situation where the last thing you want to do is have to bend these horns in order to continue wedging. Luckily, I'm at a point right now that I don't really need to bend anything. I can just smash the horns back into the head and kind of get this ball shape back. So you're better off doing that than folding anything. So once you get it back into a shape that you can deal with, then you're ready to start wedging again. One thing that I also see happen quite a bit is not pulling all the way up to the chin. If you don't pull all the way up to the chin, you don't end up with this nice rocking motion. Do you see how nice that is? If that's not happening to you, one reason could be that you are not pulling it all the way up to the chin. So that's what that should look like before you actually push it away from you. Let's see, another thing that happens is when you're pushing away from you, you end up flipping it this way away from you to do it again. You just want to remember that you're always pulling towards you. So once you end down away it, you rock it back to you and pull that all the way up to the bull's chin. Okay, so that is the bull's head, or otherwise known as ram's head. The other way of wedging is called the spiral. When you spiral, it is very similar, but instead you're almost giving it a little twist. So let me get this back into the initial ball. Now from here, I'm still going to go ahead and pull it up, but this time I'm going to, my hands are at the top, and I'm going to push and almost twist a little bit. So I'm kind of twisting a little bit, and then when I go with my fingertips to pull it back up, I'm going to pull it up kind of at an angle. Eventually, it will start to make these little layers here, and you can see that this is the tip of the shell. This is if it were a shell, this is the top of the shell. So when I'm pulling toward me, I'm always going right up to the tip. So now it's a little bit easier to see. I'm going to pull it by the point that's furthest away from me. I'm going to pull it up to the tip, and then I'm going to press down and kind of spiral a little bit, and then whoosh, spiral it back up. Although it looks a little bit harder, once you get into it, it goes really fast. I'm also pivoting on this part of my knuckle. So you can see I'm never like really disengaging with my not dominant hand. And that'll give you a form that looks like this. So when do you know that you are finished wedging? That's always a question that doesn't really have an answer. The more that you start to work with clay, you're going to start feeling your clay, this is going to sound weird, loosen and tighten at the same time. You'll feel like it's more malleable, like it's kind of moving a little bit better, but you also feel like it's become more dense. That's when you know that you are good to go with the wedging. The other thing that you'll see people do is take their wire tool, the cut-off wire, and they'll open it up, and if you do not see any air bubbles, then you know that you're good. I do have to say though, you don't want to wedge for 5 minutes. If you wedge for 5 minutes, you are going to kill your clay by all the water being pulled out of it through your hands and through whatever you're actually wedging on. So you don't want to do that. If you do end up cutting your clay in half, you also don't want to put the two halves together that are flat. You're going to hear me say this a lot. It's always going to be putting something round against something. That way, if there is any air, it's going to be pressed outwards. So if you are going to do something like this, just make sure you slap something that is rounded against it. And then at this point, you can go ahead and just give another quick wedge to get your shape somewhat back. And then at this point, you're going to form this into whatever shape you need it. If I were going to go on the wheel, I would feel fine with just keeping it shaped like this. I've got my nice rounded bottom, which we always want for the air thing. Some people like to make a ball to go on the wheel. You can do that if you want to do that. Again, try not to overwork your clay. Just get it to the shape you need it. If you are going to be working with pinch pots, you can go ahead and shape it into a ball at this point. If you are going to be making slabs, I think it's always a great idea to go ahead and use your table and start making a cube out of it so that you can slice and get it ready so you can get it ready to go on the slab roller. This will be in a different video, but I do want to show you what that would look like. It's always best to try to use your table to do any pounding that you need to do, any working that you need to do, because it is a lot better on your wrists. So that's wedging for you. Yes, you do have to do it. No, you can't get away with not doing it. We don't want things to blow up in the kiln. We don't want things to pop off in the kiln. So, happy wedging. You know what to do if you have any questions.